Naragon, for joining us, Professor Emeritus at Manchester University in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and international Kant expert.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Justin.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it would be good to start with question would be why Kant? Why are you interested in Kant? Why is he relevant?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of philosophers you might get interested in out there. Um, I got started on Kant when I was an undergraduate. I had a professor who told me if I wanted to understand anything going on now, that I'd have to sooner or later figure out what Kant was up to. And honestly, that's what got me started. Traveled over to Germany, learned German, took classes on Kant while I was over there, and I never stopped. I guess I went to grad school, studied more Kant, and yeah, I'm still at it. So it's habit by now. I wouldn't know what to do otherwise. But I studied a lot of other people, of course, and there were so many wonderful other philosophers to study. I enjoy Plato and Aristotle, for instance, quite a lot. The 20th century French philosophers, not so much, but that's why we have you, Justin.
Good. Well, they're maddening to read.
Yeah, but I do believe, I think I was given good advice from my professor way back when I was an undergraduate. I don't know how you could fully understand what's going on in the world of ideas now, without some sense of what Kant did, because he so changed everything, the way we think in the West, and not just in what you might think of a narrow philosophical sense, but in the way that scientists think about the world and do their thing. Um, I suppose social sciences as well, psychologists for sure. Um, so yeah, I think I chose well. I think I was well guided.
Absolutely. Well, so what is it that was his Copernican revolution?
Well, it's hard to know where to start.
Yeah.
Especially if you're starting out cold and you don't know anything about him. But if you remember when he lived, it was in the 1800s. I'm sorry, the 1700s, 18th century, and it was modernity was already underway for a century or so. Descartes was a century or so before him. Newton had lived and died and made his mark and was considered pretty much I don't know, the god of the scientists. And that's how all educated people in the West were thinking about the natural world. They were thinking about it in Newtonian terms. And that might not seem like much. And a lot of people, if they're not interested in science, might not even think much about Newton, but he was the guy who helped us understand the natural world as this single thing. There wasn't just our Earth and then the stars up there. There was this one thing. The Earth was a part of it. I was just wanting to put Kant in context a little bit because it's hard to understand why he did what he did if you don't understand when he was doing it. And he was working at a time when all educated people were essentially Newtonians or something like that. They understood the world as just so many physical objects in motion, following these universal laws. And that was a helpful way. That was a very helpful way to think, where you could have a mathematical understanding of the physical universe. There are problems with that, though, that most people would recognize immediately, and that's that since human beings are, after all, physical objects, then our bodies are following those same natural laws as the moon and water and the stars and everything else. And that's kind of cool if you think about it just as bodies, but of course we think of ourselves as so much more than that. We're persons. And among other things, persons have a certain dignity about them, and they also have a free will, which is partly what their dignity rests in. We're able to freely choose to do this or do that, to say yes or to say no, and for our own reasons, and not because we're impelled. I mean, you always have somebody put a gun to your head and make you say something, but it's up to you to decide whether you're actually going to say it, or at least what you're going to think. So you've got that basic problem of being confronted by a science which seems overwhelmingly correct, this Newtonianism, but that very science absolutely reduces the human being to nothing, just a sack of dirt or ashes. So how can you how can you make room for that science and still leave room for the human soul? And I don't mean the soul in any fancy religious sense even, but just what the inside of ourselves, the way we think about ourselves, our emotional lives.
So subjectivity in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's one thing that Kant was worried about. He was exposed to Newton. Newton was still kind of new, but everybody who was developed in their thinking, they were older, they were on top of him. And Kant had a professor who who had a good library and was teaching him Newton. That's where he first came to learn that stuff. And Kant was pretty bright, so he picked it up pretty quickly, saw the implications, and so that for him became an important puzzle. He wasn't the only guy thinking about it either. That was an important puzzle for everybody. Where do we fit human beings into this picture? So that's one thing he was doing.
Hmm.
There's another puzzle though that hit him not when he was in school as a university student, but a little bit later. He started reading David Hume. He was actually good friends with some Englishmen who lived in Königsberg where he lived. They also spoke German. He didn't speak English. He didn't really read English content. But it was partly through them that he was being uh, that he learned about David Hume. And I don't know if your students have even come across that word, David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, 1711 to 1776. Kant and Hume never met. I don't think Hume ever heard of Kant. I don't know why. I know we have no reason to believe they ever did.
Hmm.
But Hume did a whole lot of things. Talked about a great deal in philosophy. But one of the most important points that he made uh, for our purposes here is that he noted that if we think about what we know about the physical world, the world that scientists are talking about when they're doing their Newtonian thing, we think about that world, well, what is it? It's this world that we sense. We see it, we hear it, we touch it, and so on. And it enters our mind just as these separate ideas, or he calls them impressions. And if you study that closely, if you study that carefully, you'll realize that that's all there is as far as the physical universe. The physical universe, in the end, as far as we can tell, is nothing more than these series of impressions. A color, a patch of blue there, a certain sound here. They come in combinations, but ultimately they're just these separate impressions. And he spent some time arguing about this, but it's pretty convincing that these impressions enter our minds entirely separate, one from the other. They are absolutely separate. It often happens that whenever you see somebody move their hands together, you'll also hear a sound like that. But it doesn't have to be that way. And we just come to believe that you'll hear a certain effect. We call it an effect. That you'll hear a certain impression when you see another impression, or vice versa. So we make these connections, but they're simply based on past experience. They're not based on any sort of necessity. Now, that thought of Hume's caused for Kant another problem. See, one problem he had with the natural sciences, how does human beings fit into that?
Yeah.
Where do we find our freedom? But he also found a problem with the natural sciences themselves. He cared about them deeply. In fact, most of what he wrote for the first 20 years or so, first 10 years, I guess, was what we would all call in the sciences, in the natural sciences. He wasn't really doing what we would recognize as philosophy when he was younger. He thought of himself as a natural scientist in many ways. And he cared about that project, but given Hume's writings, it wasn't clear that that project was going to work anymore, because one thing that the natural sciences need are these laws that govern the way the world works. But a law requires necessity. A law doesn't mean, well, sometimes it is this way and sometimes it isn't. You know, I don't know, F equals MA applies constantly, always, all the time, no exceptions. But that doesn't seem possible given what Hume just told us, namely that the physical world, broken down to its basics, as far as we experience it, are just so many impressions that are absolutely disconnected one from the next. So Kant was trying to figure out some way of providing these universal laws for the natural sciences. That's one thing he was trying to do. And another thing he was trying to do, sort of on the other side, was once we've once we've saved science for itself, how do we save human beings as a part of this physical universe, but something also beyond it? So those are two very different projects. And the one is basically epistemological, which is what we think of what he typically was doing in the Critique of Pure Reason, trying to show that there were certain things we could know about the physical world that are true, even before we see it, even before we experience it. We know that when you open up your eyes and you start experiencing the natural world, it'll have certain features. That's something that that was something new. That was something new that he did. And I think that's true. What he did was correct, that there really are certain features of the natural world that we know, even before we experience it, that it will be like that. Those are those universal laws that have that certainty about them. As for the other puzzle, how human beings can have any sort of dignity or worth about them, he had this to say, that the only reason we're able to know with certainty certain features of the physical universe is because that physical universe isn't the real world. It's just what we call the phenomenal world or the apparent world. So he very quickly drew this distinction between, and it uses these terms that he got from the old Greeks, the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. The phenomenal world is just the world as we experience it. And that's not just us as sort of uninformed animals, but as scientists, who are studying it closely, still, we're always experiencing it in this way. We have access only to that phenomenal world. The noumenal world is the world as it really is. So you have reality or the noumenal world, and appearance or the phenomenal world. In the phenomenal world, all these laws that have this absolute certainty that Kant felt that he proved, applies. So there's this absolute necessity that flows through that phenomenal world. But it's fully possible, and he doesn't say that we know this, we can't know this because you can't know anything about the noumenal world or reality. But the noumenal world would include us as thinking beings, not the self as you're aware of yourself, but simply the self as the actor, the agent.
If you could say more about that'd be like this, in the sense of, would that be that interiority, that subjectivity, that's something that we know intuitively, but we can't describe because we are it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost that. When you're aware of yourself experiencing something, like I am now listening to this guy talk about Kant. That's what he would call your phenomenal self. That's how you are appearing to yourself. It is interior because there's nobody else can have that experience. So it's it's an unusual part of the phenomenal world. Some things in the phenomenal world, like the rooms that we're in, we can all be there and experience the same things from slightly different perspectives, of course. With each of us look at a rectangular table, but for one of us, it might look like a certain kind of, it'll be some sort of parallelogram for each of us. It'll have a slightly different shape just because of just our spatial perspective. But it's something that we can share. If it's this interior experience, it's still an appearing, but it's something that simply appears to me or appears to you because it's inside your mind, inside my mind. That's still a phenomenal world, though. That's not the noumenal self.
So the X that stuff appears to, both
Mhm.
of those would still be phenomenal.
Yes. No, well, the X is what's behind. And for those of you that haven't read the Critique of Pure Reason, Justin is referring to a passage where he talks about this noumenal self as this X, this transcendental X. He calls it X because that's all we can say. We know it's there, but that's it. We know it exists, but that's all. And and that's one thing that if you always keep that in mind when you're reading Kant, it'll keep you from making all kinds of mistakes. It's just a certain like a little anchor. You really can't know anything about the noumenal world, according to Kant. Now, he might be wrong about that.
Except that it is.
Except that it is, that's all. Yeah, there were philosophers following him that insisted that indeed we do have knowledge of this noumenal world, and they tried to do it by going through the self. saying, no, the self really is something that we can know in its reality. Kant would say that he'd been misunderstood, but they at least thought, Fichte, was one of those guys. He was the first guy out of the gate, thinking he was, trying to perfect Kant. So,
Hate to admit that I love him.
yeah, no, and he's interesting. These guys are all interesting, but they're sadly wrong. But they're wrong. They're wrong in interesting ways. Same way with Hegel. But you see, this is where freedom becomes possible for Kant, and our own human dignity, that we're not just these phenomenal objects where virtually all of our actions are causally determined, caused by previous events, but rather that we have this possibility of actually choosing actions, and that comes from this noumenal self, where the noumenal self is the real self that stands behind the experienced self. And insofar as you are even aware of yourself choosing or willing, Kant would still want to say that's simply how you're experiencing yourself. That's still the phenomenal or the empirical self. But it's at least possible that there's this noumenal self making these choices. And so human freedom is possible even in this Newtonian world of absolute causation, thoroughgoing causation.
But so I'm struggling here between possible and that it definitely exists, but we don't know anything about it.
Mm. Oh, well, in some ways it almost can seem trivial. And sometimes it can fall into a kind of triviality, because take anything at all, take your hand, take a look at it and say, that there is a phenomenal hand. It's because it's the hand as it appears to you. But what's doing the appearing? Well, the hand in itself, right? Just it's the hand in itself. So you might say, well, behind every empirical object, any phenomenal object, there'll be a noumenal object that's appearing to you. So your relationship to it is only as it appears to you. You can only know it as it appears to you, but you can't know it as it is in itself. That might almost seem like a kind of trivial claim, which is good in a way, because then it's obviously true. But you might also wonder, but why even say it? I mean, what's gained by that? But what's gained is this: even though we can talk like that meaningfully, and I think it's helpful even, we then have to step back and realize that we don't know whether the real hand is anything like the phenomenal hand. It's simply that X, which is appearing to me as a hand. As Kant would say, for all we know, actually, I don't think he ever says this, but he should. I mean, he could easily say this. For all we know, there's simply this reality, which is appearing in all these various guises, and even appears as subjects, such that me looking at my hand might be nothing more than reality experiencing itself. Nothing more than that. I mean, it's something like a Spinozistic metaphysics.
So in that case, if the X that is behind my perception, right? What you've done there is to say that X is either interacting with another X or itself. Am I correct on that? Like, so this hand that's before me is it the same thing or is it something else? Does he say something? Do you follow?
Yeah, no, you just say, yeah, it could be one, it could be the other. We have no way of deciding that, is the takeaway there. There is this noumenal world and we know nothing about it. So it could be this monolithic one thing. It could be like, Spinoza's God.
Mm-hmm.
And there's mystics that would feel very comfortable with this very thought. The only difference there'd be many differences between Kant and that mystic. But Kant would be totally comfortable by giving the mystic the possibility that his beliefs are true. Just that we can't know that. It's just a guess. It's just a thought, nothing more. So I don't know, and Kant wouldn't know whether there's multiple X's that are these noumenal objects, or there might be just one big noumenal object and one big noumenal subject, or there could be multiples of all of these. Now, he would say that we need to assume, for the sake of morality, that there isn't just one monolithic noumenal subject underlying each one of us, but rather each one of us is separate. because he felt that that was a requirement of our moral lives, that we see each other uh, as distinct individuals, unique individuals, that they're not just, that you aren't just an extension of me, and that I could, you know, deal with you the way I might deal with my left toe or something like that.
Hmm. Well, the Cappadocian fathers and the great mother of them, Crina the Elder, they had something not too dissimilar to that. But
Mhm.
I mean, I doubt that Kant would be on board with it. But that the way that we can think of pure light or white light going through a prism, so
Mhm.
that that kind of X is percated into different, divided into different manifestations of it,
Yeah,
and then that kind of they're interacting with each other.
yeah. No, his only complaint with um, any of these claims would simply be if they thought that they somehow knew that,
Hmm.
that that isn't something they could know. But then you have to be careful on how you mean what you mean by the word know, of course, because they would say, "Oh, I know it." And, you know, there'd have to be a conversation there. You know, what is it you're actually saying there? Because he would say it's just a surmise. It can't be anything more than
Well, not to take us too far afield, but it was a question that I had written down that I mentioned before, was just that this it relates to me the way that a mathematician might, when you were saying what we know, what we can know,
that.
that a mathematician might know something is true prior to um, proving it, or
Well, you might have a hunch
discovering.
that it's true.
I'm sorry.
You might have a hunch that it's true.
Yeah. So what is that hunch? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's different in terms of the, religious studies side of this. There's different ways of knowing. Like, if I have someone says I don't believe in God, I probably agree with them. But just, well, what methods of inquiry have you used? And certainly, science is not going to help you with that. But maybe going to a cave for a while or helping people that are in absolute destitution and poverty, that might be a way of inquiring into that.
Yeah. Yeah, if God doesn't exist for them, they might be looking in the wrong places.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So different modes of knowing.
Yeah, but what the
Yeah.
mathematics was an important topic for Kant. He brings it up often, not just in like the Critique of Pure Reason, which is, you know, his main first big massive tome, but in earlier works as well, as different ways of knowing. There's the way the mathematician operates, and there's the way the philosopher operates, and there's also the way the natural scientist operates, and those are different methods. And what the mathematician is doing is she's simply constructing things, and and so you know it perfectly, know with absolute certainty because you just made it.
Hmm.
Whereas the philosopher, or for that matter, the natural scientist trying to understand the bones of the physical universe, they're not making it. Nobody believes that, and Kant certainly doesn't. We're not making it, we're discovering it. So you're not going to know it in advance, except for these set of principles that Kant eventually comes up with. There are some few things, and they're formal aspects of the physical universe that we can know in advance. But at least initially, you know, no one could know any of that in advance. You're simply going out into the world, and until you see it or experience it, you won't have any knowledge of it. You know, it's that distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions or truths that Kant, Kant talks about.
Do you want to say more about that? I'm not sure that one would
Well, most
understand.
people probably wouldn't know about them. Yeah. And it wasn't new to Kant. There were other philosophers who were making this distinction between an analytic truth and a synthetic truth. And it's pretty straight. It's easy enough, the distinction. An analytic truth is one that's true simply by definition. So you think about a certain, and so there will be analytic propositions, which they could be false by definition, but otherwise, they could be true. But whether they're true or whether they're false is true in a necessary way. So if you define, I use this example with students, and there's some confusion on what a bachelor is now, I've discovered. And that's okay.
Tell
Languages,
me, I'm one.
yeah, it changes. Yeah, so you say. But the traditional, and we probably are in agreement here, the traditional definition of a bachelor is simply an unmarried man,
Hmm.
right? Unmarried man, a man who's unmarried. So bachelor just equals unmarried man. So to say that a bachelor is unmarried is to say something that's true by definition. You're simply discovering, you're teasing out one property of bachelor and saying it's that. But it's all just a part of being a bachelor. So before you even look at a bachelor, you'll know he's unmarried, right? So that's an analytic truth, and you can know it with certainty. Mathematics is nothing but that, traditionally. A synthetic truth is something you can only know by looking at it. So, for instance, I could be told that there's a bachelor behind that door, but I won't know whether that bachelor has brown hair or black hair or is bald until I open the door and look. So to say that the bachelor behind that door has brown hair, that's a synthetic truth, and you'll only know it's true by actually looking. And most philosophers believed all philosophers believed prior to Kant that all propositions were either analytic or they were synthetic. And analytic truths were necessary, and synthetic truths were always what we call contingent. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're false. It just depends. And what Kant did, I mean, one way, and this is how he kind of thought about it too. You could think about this, that what he did was he came up with a group of propositions which were synthetic. So they were about the way the world is. They weren't about definitions, but they were, that's a new term. They were a priori knowable. You could know them prior to experience.
And that's the meaning for a priori.
Yeah, a priori means you know something prior to experience. A posteriori is something that you know only after experience or posterior to experience. So you can think about these terms almost as in two different columns. Analytic propositions are knowable a priori, and they're necessarily true. Synthetic propositions are knowable only a posteriori, and they're only contingently true. Contingent meaning they're not necessary.
Yeah.
They could have been otherwise. The guy behind the door could have had red hair instead of gray hair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kant had red hair before it turned white. Although he usually wore a wig, so you didn't see it.
Great. I know I need to start
That
doing
was
that.
back then.
Well, Steve, what does he say about intentionality? Like this way in which I think, in terms of modern contemporary discussions of the mind and body problem, or however the analogy of the computer and so on, I don't reflect reality per se on that blank slate, but rather I reach out to it. I only look at, I don't just receive the world. I attend to it. Um, uh, what would he say about that, or would he disagree with that? I'm not a camera staring at some vista and reflecting it, right? But rather that I'm attending to it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm trying to think whether he doesn't use that. He doesn't use that kind of concept. He doesn't use a term like intentionality the way we use it now. I mean, that's something kind of new. I mean, that's the last 100 years, isn't it? I don't. It might have analogs in earlier philosophers.
Certainly, Plotinus and those Neoplatonists have this idea of eros and being drawn towards the world, and
of course, that comes right out of Plato, actually.
Yeah.
But knowledge itself is he would say erotic. The first time I heard that, it was in grad school. I thought, really, is that true? But all he meant was something that's actually pretty fascinating. That reason itself draws you to something. That the mind itself is moving you towards something. Because you might say, you might know all kinds of things about the world, but until you care about it, you're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
And Plato had that notion that the care was built right into the knowing, which wouldn't have to be that way. It is for humans, though. And other animals, insofar as they know it. So it gets us off the couch.
Yeah.
And moving in the world because we care about it. We care as we move into the world. We do it because we care about things. We invest them. We fill them with meaning that we care about.
Yeah.
Sometimes the meaning is a negative sort, and we run away, right? But it's filled with meaning. That's how we discover it. And Kant doesn't do that. He doesn't. I don't know. He says all kinds of other cool stuff about how we find beauty in the world and how unusual that is because it's so subjective. When you look at a sunset and it just strikes you with such beauty, or a little baby or a flower, and it seems very private and so intense. And yet in doing that, I think most people would sort of expect that others looking at that sunset or that baby's face or that flower, that they should also be filled with wonder when they see it. They don't always, but usually they are. And that in itself, if you reflect on it, it's kind of amazing that something so intensely personal and private is almost universal. He does talk about that, but investing the world automatically, spontaneously with meaning. I mean, in my mind, that comes from Heidegger. Maybe you'll find that in some of the ancients. Usually there is something that, something that you thought about that seems really modern. Somebody did it 2,000 years ago already.
I feel that way when I read the fourth century, Byzantine theologians. And my favorite, I think, work of all time is Gregory Nyssa's on
Mhm.
death and resurrection. And just a powerful Platonic dialogue with his sister after she died.
Uh-huh.
And in terms of intentionality and things of what you're saying, but something I've been reflecting on as I read modern philosophers and say contemporary ones is where that what the Greeks called the nous, this intuitive knowing that that you were, and I don't know if there's any relationship between the noetic, the nous, this intuitive knowing, not a conceptual knowing, and Kant's noumenal. Why those words? Did he choose those?
Yeah, they might be etymologically related. I'm not sure.
They are, but I can't determine if that's something he was
But
going for.
yeah, and that nous that shows up in Plato too. Actually, I'm not sure what Plato means by that. It's puzzling. The passages where he talks about that, I think. But Kant does talk about a thing called intuitive knowledge or intuitive understanding, um, but not as something that humans have. You would say if there is such a thing as intuitive understanding, that's only for God,
Hmm.
where it doesn't require concepts. It's immediate. It's not discursive. And so as far as he's concerned, that's merely a thought.
Hmm. Okay.
I mean, he doesn't think you can prove God's existence. God's existence isn't something that we can know. For Kant.
For Evagrius, this great kind of teacher of the church and its prayer practices, incredible theologian, fourth century, got caught up, in a scandal with a woman that was in the high court of the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire at the time. And then he ran away, dropped off his sister at a monastery, as anyone would, and then went to Egypt for the rest of his life. But he spoke much about the nous kind of mirroring itself. And he would say it has the pure color of sapphire. But anyway, but in terms of developing how to fold back intuition on itself, and that and for him, well, granted, it's really difficult to know what he was going for, but that the soul or the kind of spiritual aspect of a person would be that one source that is through a prism then manifested in these different ways. And it would be a different way of knowing again. So a knowing versus that is not conceptual.
Right.
For Evagrius, for Origen, for Plotinus, for Plato. I mean, that different way of knowing, and I don't know what that means, but I've been far more. I just find it more compelling lately.
Yeah. Well, I guess, and people talk like that, and so there you are. We have to deal with it. But I think one thing that would be always important to say, and this would be something Kant would want to point out, is that you can use the word know, but you want to be really careful to distinguish that way of knowing from the knowing that we have in our everyday lives. Like where you know where your car keys are, and you know that the sun will probably rise in the morning and set in the evening, which is essentially the same kind of knowing that natural scientists are engaged in trying to understand the physical universe. That's a conceptual sort of knowing, and that's the kind that Kant was talking about. But there could be this other sort. He talks about it. I guess if nothing else, he'd simply want to say that's different. That's different. And I suppose you might say, in the end, you've grasped the truth, and that's all that matters. Knowing is simply grasping the truth about the way things are. But the guys you're reading, I think if you were to ask them, so are you knowing something that's real? Are you the thing that's in your hand? Is that reality of some sort? And I'm sure they would probably say yes. Don't you think?
Hmm.
Mystical understanding of the
Yeah.
presence of God. I mean, if God isn't real, there's nothing that's real, right? So I mean, God would be that which is real, the ground of reality. And Kant would say that's never possible. That's simply not possible with his use of the word knowledge.
Hmm.
Um, the thing that's going to be in your hand that knowledge seeks is only going to be some truth about the physical universe, the world of experience. Um, and so he's not at odds with these other guys, but he's just saying these are separate kinds of knowledge. It's almost better if we had different words for it so we don't confuse ourselves.
It's almost like Wittgenstein protecting what is unsayable
Yeah, yeah,
from the said, right? Or
yes,
in Christian and Jewish and Islamic language of the apophatic, what you can't name,
yes,
versus the kind of cataphatic, what can be said,
yeah,
and protecting those two things.
yeah. And it's maybe a little harsh of Wittgenstein to talk about that which can't be said because it's sort of implying, hey, mystic, stop talking. You can't say this stuff, right? And I don't think he probably intended that
Oh,
either. But
now
there's
I'm
some,
out of a job. Thanks.
yeah, exactly, right. You want to be able to talk about it because you're trying, but it's always this asymptotic sort of thing. You're always trying to move closer to this truth with your words, but you're not going to nail it. You're not going to get it exactly. All you can do is kind of gesture at. That's certainly what I think what Wittgenstein would probably say. At least it's not early Wittgenstein. Certainly what Kant would say. You're not going to be able to grasp reality. You can only sort of point at it. And you can't know anything about
Hmm. Well, one thing I really appreciate about your approach to Kant and the way that you're sharing this in every one of our conversations in your office is what, forgive me, what can seem like a stale philosophy, right? In terms of the critique of pure reason, and pick that up on a Saturday evening and just, well, maybe you do, but and just read through it. But that there was a serious passion and pathos in Kant and what he was doing.
it.
And I really appreciate the way that you share that. So two questions, we don't have to go beyond that I wanted to just address was, um, what does he think about love?
Mm.
And then, and I know that you've worked so much in his biography and his life and his lecture notes and so on. And then secondly, the notion of the sublime. I've always been curious about Kant's
Oh, yeah,
idea or
it's
the
a sublime.
perception of the sublime. Yeah. And then in terms of, that's been helpful for me in thinking theologically.
Yeah. Well, of course, his understanding of the sublime is goes hand in hand with his understanding of the beautiful. They're different aspects, but they're both of them aesthetic responses to the world. He talked about the sublime and the beautiful early when he was a very young man before he wrote this critique, which he was like in his late 50s. And then in this critique of judgment, the critique of the power of judgment, it's a third critique. You know about those, but those your students wouldn't. He wrote three critiques in the end. He only thought you needed one, but after he wrote the first one, he realized there's so much to be said about ethics that he ended up spinning out a second critique, the critique of practical reason, reason as it moves. And the critique of judgment then followed shortly after that, where he talks about, among other things, the beautiful and the sublime. But the sublime is just this mathematical thing, this huge, it's something that's scary from a distance. It's not,
Hmm.
yeah, man, it's been a while since I've tried to explain that. Yeah, let me put that to the side for a minute, because that's sort of a big topic.
Sure.
As far as love, he knows it
That's
exists.
that's that's scandalous. You just said love is not as big of a topic as the sublime, but that's definitely true.
It's actually not for him. It's funny, he talks about pathological love, which seems offensive. But the falling in love that is important to people, it's a kind of pathology, which means it's a disease. It comes it comes from passion. It's um, so he's not saying that it's something bad, but of course we can't be expected to fall in love with everybody. In fact, that would be strange. Like when you're supposed to like love your neighbor, you're not talking about that pathological love, falling in love. So there's that, right?
Why
When you say
not?
love, you know about this more than I do, because you're always dealing with that sort of thing. Love is one of those really crazy words. It's even slipperier than the word God, probably. 'Cause it means literally very different things.
Well, the Greeks thankfully had a number of words for it, a
For them,
minimum of
yes.
three, but more than that. But yeah,
I know
thank
English, we
God.
have a huge vocabulary. We haven't got any other words really. I mean, isn't it strange? It is. It's very unusual. Yeah. So he said, well, pathological love. Yeah, that's there. But there's not much more to be said about it either. He didn't. He did talk quite a bit about our proper relationship with each other, though, which involves respect. That we need to respect each other regardless, and it's because of our ability to reason out different courses of action that we're free agents, free beings in the world. It's this emphasis on autonomy that we find in our society all the time, like with respect to medical ethics, that for a patient in their right state of mind should be given the choice whether they're going to take a medicine or not. Even if every physician they talk to says, you need to take this medicine, if they're competent, most people would agree you should not make the person do it, because that would be a failure of respecting them as a person, right? Um, That's not love for Kant, or if it is, it's a totally formal love. But you're respecting the spark of what you might even call the divine that's in that being that you have to honor. And that's something that wasn't around much until Kant, and now it's absolutely universal in the Western world, at least.
Hmm.
And as far as his biography goes, I think he fell in love a couple times, but he was always so slow to act. He stayed a bachelor all his life. There were a couple of women that he was interested in, but it took him a while before it wasn't until 1770. He was what, 56? It wasn't until he was 56 that he got a full-time job. I mean, he was teaching, but only as a lecturer. And the way things were back then, you got paid by the students at the end of the semester. And a lot of the students were poor, so he'd say, no, don't worry about it. So he never really had a stable salary until he was made a full professor of logic and metaphysics.
So what did he live off of?
Well, the honoraria that students would pay him, those who could. And he got a job as a librarian for a short while that he was doing on the side. Most professors oh, Justin.
It's not that different.
No, they were overworked and underpaid. And a lot of the professors, like in theology, also were pastors or had some position with the church, so they had various sources of income.
Good
so
idea.
that actually is one reason why he never got married. He was just slow because he couldn't support anybody, or he wasn't sure he could. But if he would have gotten married, that would have changed things a lot. It's hard to imagine Kant getting married, or a lot of these philosophers. In fact, I had a professor. He was at Notre Dame. He was a priest, so he's arguing from that position. But he said, you gotta have to decide. You're going to marry philosophy, or you're going to marry another human being. You choose. You can't do both. I don't know.
You can marry Christ.
Or that, yes, become a nun or a monk, yes. Yeah, so he talked about love a little bit, but love, of course, is many things. And for himself, he had many great friends. He was a wonderful friend, and most of them were men. Most of them were men. God, yeah. There was one woman that he was a friend to. She was a countess. She was sort of the life of the society. She and her husband. And he had a standing invitation to their dinner, at their house for dinner all the time. She would count as a friend, but otherwise, all of they were all men for the most part. Very close friendships there.
And he had a dog, right?
No, nah,
But he did.
Dog. No, he didn't have a dog.
Didn't Schopenhauer try to model his life on Kant or something like that?
Oh, he did. Yeah, Schopenhauer was convinced that he understood Kant better than anybody else. But that's what a lot of people thought. I mean, honestly, there were dozens of people who felt that they were the true bearers of the Kantian philosophy. And of course, Schopenhauer came quite a bit after Kant. Well, not long after, but like they never met. They didn't overlap at all. And he slept with a pistol under his gun, so there's that. right? A pistol, God, what? A pistol under his pillow, sorry.
Yep.
A pistol under his gun.
Yep. Have two. Why not? Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. He's Proto-American. Um, well, before we close, did you have anything you wanted, and maybe it's too much, just on the sublime or the question of the sublime? Uh, yeah, you said that was a big topic, so I don't want to broach it if it's too intense, but
You know,
yeah.
there was something I was actually I thought I might even read, comes out of um, the very end of the critique of practical reason. So that second critique that's mostly on moral philosophy, it's a phrase that everybody, almost anybody who's heard about Kant probably came across. It wasn't on his tombstone. There was some Latin stuff on his tombstone, but there was always a plaque. Well, there's a plaque now, but there was a plaque above his tombstone in Königsberg, Kaliningrad now, with this quote, and it shows up in various other places. And I got it here. This is how he closes his critique of practical reason, and it actually is a nice summary of what he's most interested in his philosophy. He says, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Two things. The starry heavens, those are sublime. Just they're so vast, they're so big, they overwhelm us. But of course, in talking about that, he's talking about this natural world too, which in itself is sublime. It's just this huge, massive thing. It's also something that natural scientists routinely study. That's one. And the other is the moral law within me, which he would understand with a kind of sublimity too. The sort of thing that would just make you quiet and reverent. Because what is that? That's this moral law, this sense of duty and obligation towards others. You didn't make it up, although famously you kind of do because you find it within yourself. But you didn't make it up, and it's there like this bright diamond that can't be broken or changed. Oh, and so that's what's on the plaque. If you read the rest, though, he says, I don't need to search for these things, you know, the heavens, the law, and merely conjecture them as though they were veiled in obscurity or in the transcendent region beyond my horizon. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my own existence. So just as certain as you are of your own existence, and anybody after Descartes would say, yeah, I know that with absolute certainty if I know anything. Well, he would say, yeah, and this moral law I discover within me. And that's as clearly true and obvious as anything. And so now what are you going to do with that? You know, he does his philosophy, tries to save morality from Newtonian science, tries to save Newtonian science from Humean skepticism. That's a lot for one guy.
I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful, uh, piece that you read. And I think of those moments in life where something that is awful, not in with an E, right? Like something that is awe-inspiring and shudders you in fear, but it is somehow at a particular vantage is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Or I felt like I got that when I many years ago in undergrad reading some Kant, just that struck me, and I'm not doing any justice to it, but there's something that stayed with me there of that sublime moment where it doesn't fall into good or evil or pleasurable or traumatic, but there's this moment where
You fall to your knees and
yeah,
this reverential awe.
for me that was in terms of religious studies and in terms of working with monastic spirituality, that always struck me as undeniably true.
Mm-hmm.
um, I guess we'll use the word intuition, not demonstrable, but just it strikes one.
Yeah. It's something that anybody who has enough time, and I suppose a full belly, but you don't even need that. But
Yeah.
it's open to anybody to discover these things. And then you're left with that question, also, what is that? And if you keep asking that question, pretty soon you're doing philosophy or you're doing religious studies.
Yeah. Or if you, I mean, there's something about the human person to say that there is an explanation I try to get comfortable with there may not be, and I can't adjust to that. Uh, I Even though that it may definitely be the case that like stuff happens for no reason or whatever, or the world is completely contingent, it can be completely another way, but at least the way I live, I can't allow myself to get there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we always try to make sense as best we can of what
But
we're
the fact that the mind in Kant was it so helpful for me for this is so attuned. I mean, our categorical, like the apparatus in which we see things, these transcendental, these categories of, from taste and space, and that I'm already imposing on the world before I ever receive anything,
right.
and uh, the way that for the ancients that would the fact that the mind is that the world, excuse me, is so transparent to the mind is significant.
Well, it can't be whole. Yeah, yeah. It just occurred to me when you were mentioning, some of the strangest stuff about Kant I didn't mention because there's so many things to talk about. But I had to at least affirm something you had said that space and time, something that we take for granted. That there's this spatiality in the world and that it's flowing and that time and it's everything's happening in time. He felt that he had strong and certain arguments that space and time are obvious features of the physical universe, but not only can we not know whether the real universe, the reality, is spatiotemporal, we have very good reason to believe it's not. So this real world, as it appears to us, is neither spatial nor temporal. And that's not, put your mind around that, and that's something he does early on in the first critique. That's enough to twist your mind right there. You realize something really important is happening here. And you might think that's crazy. And I know a lot of people don't think that well of the scientists for whatever reason, at least here in the US, where we can't even be sure viruses are real. But I think that, the physicists nowadays, well, ever since Einstein, when they're talking about the physical universe that they're studying, they don't talk about space and time. They talk about this thing that, for lack of another word, they simply call space-time. One word. It's not space and time put together. It's this space-time. That's what's real. That's a feature of reality, if anything, is according to physicists. And I don't know what Kant would actually do with that quite. But when you see that these physicists are doing that, you realize they're essentially giving a nod to Kant that reality is not space. It does not have this feature of spatiality or temporality as such.
There was Donald Hoffman, I think it's Donald, not Douglas. Donald Hoffman wrote a book recently, The Case Against Reality, and it is at least the way I understood it was a kind of a neo-Kantian, evolutionarily based critique. He's a neuroscientist out of UC Berkeley, I think, but
Okay.
but in the way that we wouldn't see reality as it is and survive well,
Right.
but the fact that we have to rethink the world that we see is really uncomfortable because space seems so true, and I mean it's real to the extent of our experience, but it's not fundamental.
Yeah. And that's true for every living thing, every little spider and fly. They're managing somehow with the patterns of the universe, just as we are.
Except for you and I.
Except for what now?
We see the world just as it is.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, beyond us. But yeah.
Yeah. I think we're already trying the patience of your students if they
yes. So, well, I wanted to thank you, and you know, it is a pleasure to speak with you because of all the people I know in the world. I believe that you're the smartest, and I'm glad that I got to use this excuse to talk with you. It's a blessing. It's incredible. So thank you for teaching me, and thank you especially for teaching me how to live a good life. And students are really have been blessed for that and teaching me. So
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about Kant. Always a
yeah.
pleasure.
Can you leave us with a final anecdote? I'm sorry. It just have, what is one funny thing that people generally don't know about Kant? And then we'll be done.
Gosh, there's so much, but I should have written something down.
Oh,
Because
no.
my head's sort of full of this stuff. Oh heavens, you should have. Oh,
Did it give you a, what was his sleep schedule? I don't, yeah, I don't know. Didn't he get
oh,
yelled
his
at or
sleep
something?
schedule. Well, when he was young, he didn't have one, but when he was old, he not only had a sleep schedule, he went to bed at like at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock. I forget what time it is, written down somewhere. Every night, he had a manservant that he'd hired. Even back when he lived in apartments, that poor guy would have to trudge there and take care of him, and then go trudge back home to his own family. And then he eventually lived with Kant, up in the attic after Kant bought a house when he had the money. But when Kant got older, he became like a clock. This is sort of that caricature that people often have of Kant if they know anything about him. But it's just the older Kant. But he even took like a cloak that he would wrap around. He would tuck part of it under one arm, and then another under the other, to kind of make himself like a mummy. And that's how he would lie in bed. And he would just be like that. It's almost like a swaddled baby, I think. And I think he might have needed to have help from his servant for that. And that's how he was all the way through the night. And then I think it was 4:30 or 5. I think it was 4:30. The servant had to come in and say, "It's time." And he was instructed not to let Kant linger. I mean, there was no snooze button. He had to get up.
So we should apply this to the university. It's a new role,
Yeah.
the waker upper, the
Mhm.
manservant.
It would just be your RA coming down, knocking at the door, and then standing there until you're out of bed. Yeah, that's not a bad way to get students going.
I actually need that myself. So,
Yeah, right.
well, thank you again, and for helping us, learn about Kant. And you just took something that is incredibly difficult to understand and made it really a thrilling moment. So, thanks a lot.
Well, good luck with all your work. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah.